Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Dearbhail McDonald and it is absolutely wonderful to join you future humans today for a brilliant fireside chat, which I know you're going to enjoy, with Tony Connelly. For Irish audiences and increasingly for international audiences, he needs absolutely no introduction. He is, of course, the Europe editor for RTE, Ireland's national broadcaster. But long before he appeared on our screens, he was an established journalist working all across the world, working in areas including Rwanda, Angola, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq and Lebanon. He's also a consummate author as well, and I'm delighted that he's joining us from Brexit land, from all the way from Brussels, to discuss the future of Europe. Tony, you're very, very welcome to Future.
Thank you very much, Dearbhail. It's a great pleasure. I'm just missing a tumbler of whiskey to go with the fireside vibe.
Well,
I guess that'll arrive any second.
Any second now. Yeah. The last time actually we saw you were broadcasting, I think, from Brussels, and it must have been a bit of a hot day because you had your suit jacket on top, but a fetching pair of trousers underneath, or shorts.
Yeah. I could still be wearing them. You never know.
Who knows? Listen, I'm going to jump straight in because long before, once upon a time in a land before Brexit, when we talked about Europe, it was about subsidies. It was the common agricultural programme. It was a different kind of things. But before Brexit happened, there were major shifts happening within Europe, some pretty big events that I suppose were the precursor or certainly contributed towards some of the biggest changes we've seen in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, before Brexit came along, you had these huge stories that just kind of consumed everything in their path. And I suppose in their own way, they maybe contributed to some of the debate around Brexit. So first of all, you had the big financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, which of course was a global crisis, but then it had a very acute fallout in Europe. The euro came under pressure, and then you had the Greek debt crisis, the Greek bailout, then you had the Irish bailout and the Portuguese bailout. And of course, we were all kind of catapulted into that in a very intense way. And for the first time in my career, you had to really specialize in a subject. And to me, that was a big uphill climb because I had no training as a financial journalist, but you suddenly had to just throw yourself into the world of bond spreads and sovereign debt and that whole lexicon of the bailout that we all remember, and to do it sort of at speed and to do it in a way that you were actually confident that you knew what you were talking about when you were going on the airwaves. It was quite, remember at the time, it was quite a fearful moment, to just suddenly have to go on the air and talk about concepts that only a few days before you had no idea what they were. But I suppose that, to me, that's one of the roles of a European correspondent in Brussels. Like a lot of your job is explaining the news as well as reporting it, because it is so technical. And then after the financial crisis, of course, we had a wave of terror attacks, a completely different skill set there for reporting. And then we had the refugee crisis, a very human story. And then Brexit happened in 2016. And yeah, it's still with us. And I think it'll be with us for some time to come.
And I think as well, our world of journalism, as we know it, was also changing, because even just that change from mainstream or legacy media, your world of work was obviously changing so much at that time. There seemed to be huge demands even just on the type and the delivery of news that was coming from Brussels and from other parts of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came to Brussels, the first 5 or 6 years were great because the world wasn't consumed with one big particular story. Okay, we had 9/11 in 2001, but that was obviously an American Middle East story. Of course, it sort of ricocheted across Europe in some respects, but there was a lot more discretion and leeway for a journalist like me to travel around Europe and do different stories. Often I go to a particular country if there was a political event there, or if an Irish minister was going there. But then you could go off and do another story when you're there. And I remember during the property boom in Dublin, like people were starting to buy property around Europe, and I could go off and do a 3-part story series on buying property in Estonia versus buying property in Croatia. It was, great fun. But, the financial crisis hit, and TV news suddenly lost that discretionary spend, and then of course the way of, I mean, when I started out here in Brussels, everything had to be sent by satellite, TV wise. Nowadays we send stuff over in a matter of seconds over the internet. But that means there's just so much more output, and then your output is spread over Twitter, over online, Instagram. So your specialization is deeper, but your dissemination is just much more horizontal and broad, and it just means you're busy all the time.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking the last beer you and I had together was on the slopes of Davos.
Oh, I remember it well.
It seems a world away for so many reasons. But just to go back, obviously, because Brexit is at the heart of the future, and also, I suppose, the past in Europe. To what extent do you think major issues like the migration crisis in Europe, that frustration with the way that Europe works, fed into the debates that ultimately contributed to that landmark vote in Britain in 2016?
Well, it was funny. I mean, if you look at some of the big European projects like the single market, that was a British idea that the British largely authored. What the single market ended up looking like. Enlargement was the first big idea that I encountered when I came to Brussels. That was 2004, and you had the 10 new countries arriving. That was the kind of rolling out of the end of the Cold War, and enlargement again was a big British idea. But yet, obviously, the UK have had issues with migration, and the UK obviously was one of the countries, including Ireland, who welcomed in all Eastern European or new country citizens to work and live in the UK. They didn't stagger it like other countries had, and I think that just became a big political problem for the UK. So, I mean, these issues are very nuanced, and if one of those issues catches fire in a particular way and it's mediated in a particular way, then it starts to take up a lot more space on the spectrum. And the Eurosceptic constituency in the UK had been growing ever since the Maastricht Treaty. And once UKIP appeared on the scene, that meant the Conservative Party was constantly being outflanked or in danger of being outflanked. So the Conservative Party had to move to the right on Europe. And there was just this momentum which built up, and lo and behold, we had Brexit. But it's important to say that the victory was narrow enough when you consider how difficult it was for people to disentangle what the EU actually is about and what it's where does the EU have competence and where it doesn't have competence. And there were a lot of things said in the referendum which just simply weren't true. This idea that Turkey could join and the UK didn't have a veto on it, not true. The whole idea about control, I mean, I think there was a bit of an idea had set in the UK that faceless bureaucrats in Brussels just made up laws and imposed them on the British citizens. And in fact, the Commission proposes laws, but the laws are actually made by British ministers and British MEPs and other MEPs and other ministers. So, there was a certain distortion of the way the EU works, which I think just got set in and got so much traction.
And Brexit happens, and here we are, 4 years later on the brink of a different type of Europe. What were the big ticket moments for you in the last 4 years that were really, really stand out for you?
Well, I guess the refugee crisis was a really big one because it involved certainly a lot more sort of boots on the ground reporting from me. I mean, just being down to Greece and Macedonia and Slovenia as the migration trail moved its way up through the Western Balkans, going to Palermo, waiting for boats coming in, an extremely difficult human story to tell, but also a very political story to tell as well, because of course you're faced with bedraggled humanity coming off boats and, walking for miles and miles and miles over fields in the Balkans, like small children, just exhausted. But at the same time, there's a political reckoning, because a lot of countries and citizens in Europe just don't want to take people in those numbers, and you had to get the balance right in that story. But then, Brexit is just an entirely different story altogether, because it's unscrambling a huge omelette. And that's sort of, even though I was fairly well versed in the minutiae of how the EU works and the single market and the customs union, there was an awful lot I didn't know, and I had to sort of start learning that from scratch.
And you decided to dig deep, because you produced your book in 2017, but you produced that book just as you and your wife Rika had a baby as well. So it was Brexit, baby, book, madness.
Brexit was born on the 23rd of June 2016, and my son Jack was born on the 3rd of September, just a few months later. So I got a commission by Penguin to write a book on Brexit and Ireland, which I sort of got thrown into in early 2017, and I sort of thought that my deadline would be the end of the year or something, but it had to be finished by June, and I started it in February, and every waking moment I had, and there weren't too many of those. I mean, there were a lot of those, not too many sleeping moments. I had to just either interview people over the phone, or transcribe interviews, or chase after people, or read reports, or try and talk to contacts, and write a book. Getting up for a 4 a.m. feed for Jack, and then just your head would be full of Brexit, so you just stay up and just write and whatever. So it was an extremely intense period, but I suppose it kind of schooled me in all the detail that I needed to have when it comes to Ireland and Brexit.
And let's talk about Ireland. I was just about to say, one of my favourite memories of that Brexit era is of you and baby Jack, the picture with the faux Ladybird Brook on the guide to Brexit. It gave me a great laugh at the time. But I want to talk to you about Ireland, and particularly for our international viewers who are tuning in, today, because Brexit was an international story, but Ireland, and by extension your reporting, became a major international story when Ireland, Brexit, the border, our relationship with the US, the UK's relationship with the US, and indeed Europe's relationship with the US, when something here, our border, became an international story in and of itself. And it led to huge demands, not just on your personal time, but of the understanding of Ireland in Europe and Europe with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, the degree to which Ireland and the Irish border just took up occupancy in the middle of Brexit and just stayed there. And all these people, I mean, like officials who work for the European Commission or the European Council or the Parliament from all over Europe, who would never have given Ireland a second thought beyond perhaps a holiday destination, were suddenly up to their knees in hedgerows and volumes of milk that would cross the border 5,000 times a minute. And to get into the politics of it, and the 800 years of history, and then also to get into the really boring technical detail about the customs union, the single market, sanitary and phytosanitary checks and controls. And of course, nobody had really thought about this during the referendum. Certainly on the UK side, I mean, the mainstream just didn't see it as an issue at all. I mean, the Irish government did see the danger signs and tried to kind of lobby, just stopping short of campaigning for a Remain vote. And then when Brexit happened, you had the Irish and British government saying in tandem, we're not going back to the borders of the past. And it was like, okay, there's a bilateral understanding that we're going to deal with this Irish question. But actually then people saying, well, how, if the UK is insisting on leaving the customs union and single market, how can you avoid a border? I mean, there's got to be a border somewhere. There's got to be a regulatory and a customs border and a sanitary and phytosanitary border. How are you going to do that? And, that was the big learning back to school moment for everybody. People had to sort of figure this out. And of course, the Irish government, I think, had a head start in terms of how they had outsourced the idea to the European Commission, and they had gone off on this pedagogical mission to educate people about the Irish border and history, and how the trade volumes north and south may not be as big as in terms of value as the trade volumes going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, but in terms of actual physical volumes, like huge and extremely important to these communities that had turned their back to each other during partition and during the years of the Troubles. But because of the Good Friday Agreement, we're now, opening up to each other through trade, through that sort of, white van trade typically. And then all the other issues of North-South cooperation that were not legally completely dependent on mutual EU law, but to a significant extent, they were dependent on both sides being in the EU.
If you're on the island of Ireland, Brexit has been the word. It has consumed us for so many years. We didn't think another story could displace it. And to some extent, the pandemic has. But obviously, we're now back in a crucial moment. But I wonder, Ireland is an island behind a bigger island that is leaving Europe, that has been an ally on many European issues, obviously, not perhaps in some others. But on that bigger question, which this fireside chat really speaks to, on the future of Europe, it's not just Brexit. We have seen populism on the march across Europe. We have seen that it has its own fractures. There is no unanimity on what the future of looks like. And happily, we are some generations away from the conditions that gave birth to Europe as we know it in terms of the world wars. Are there myths around Europe, or is its founding narrative under threat? What's its future?
Well, I suppose the kind of creation myth of Europe is the Second World War, and bringing peace to the continent after centuries of conflict, and that has perhaps outlived its purpose to some degree because it's just not as relevant to younger people. So there have been successive narratives that the EU have tried to pursue, such as climate change, pursuing Europe as a bastion of human rights values, in a world that's increasingly dominated by, big hostile monoliths like Russia or China, and under Trump, the US. So Europe, I think, is trying to present itself as the holding on to the torch of the rules-based liberal global order. But that's under attack from within. There are countries in Europe which don't have any time for that kind of vision at all.
Does it need a new narrative? Does it need a new set? Does it need to recreate that?
Well, I mean, there's a constant debate in Europe about whether having a vision is a good idea or whether you just need to show that you can make life better for people. And I think that came through during both the terror attacks. I mean, again, the wave of terror attacks in Paris and in Brussels, here in Brussels, you had attacks in Germany, then in Barcelona. Again, you had this idea of a phenomenon that doesn't recognize borders. So Europe, which doesn't recognize borders, has to kind of find a way to deal with it. And a lot of people are saying, look, we need to be able to show to citizens that we can protect them. But then, how far does Europe have a competence in crime and police and judicial cooperation? There are limits there. And then at the same time, Europe has to deal with a migration crisis, which is in some ways connected to terrorism, because some of the Paris attackers had come through the Western Balkan migration routes and exploited those. So it's very hard for the EU to kind of land on a particular stable vision of what it's there for. But the funny thing now with Brexit is that I think perhaps the EU might be less defensive on having a big, broad vision because you don't have the UK constantly putting the brakes on any sort of federal ideas. And if you're getting into things like the Green Deal, having a binding target for Europe to be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050, again, that's going to require law that member states will have to follow. and again, that's, people will say, well, that's an infringement of sovereignty. The EU will say, well, we can't tackle these global problems just, one country after another doing it by themselves. You need to have this big kind of get together to do it. So yeah, the sort of raison d'etre of Europe does keep shifting, but it keeps going as well.
Yeah, and I'm looking at you, just even at your own family circumstance. You have a son in Rome, you have your 2 kids, you have a Danish wife, you are the consummate sort of a European.
I'm completely confused. My poor kids are going to be completely confused and bewildered as well.
I know how difficult it is to get some time with you because you have such a busy workload, but it really, really seems your energy and enthusiasm. Is it one of the best briefs to have just now?
I mean, I've always felt it's as a correspondent, it is the best position to be in. I mean, perhaps more so before the big mega stories came along, over the past 10 years, because, Brussels was just basically a departure lounge for me. I mean, I was able to go and cover stories in the Middle East and Africa as well from time to time. And then, the whole Ukraine story, Russia. There were times when I was able to just get out to really far-flung places, but being able to utilize Brussels as the hub, as a crossroads for policymakers, for other journalists, for think tanks, and your ability to suddenly have to confront a particular country you'd never been to before. You have just a pool of resources at your doorstep in Brussels, people you can contact to say, so what's going on in Hungary? Who can I talk to that'll give me a bluffer's guide into the country to, start my, a brain dump of stuff you need. And, once you'd sort of mastered that particular dynamic, it is and has been a very thrilling journey. But I suppose what I would say is that, before as a correspondent, you would become a bit of a jack of all trades. But with Brexit, you have to master it. And there's a lot of other stuff that I just haven't been able to touch in the past 4 years. But trying to master a subject like Brexit, has its own sense of satisfaction. And then, you're in demand because you're broadcasting in English. You understand the story. You're Irish, so you get the whole border thing, the whole backstop thing. But yeah, it's thrilling and exhausting and very satisfying.
I have images of you having about 15 or 20 sequels to your book by the time all of this wraps up. But look, I know you're extremely busy. I'm sorry that the drink didn't arrive in time.
I'm looking at the door and it's just,
Hopefully we will get a chance to have a drink in
I hope so, yeah.
Tony Connelly, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all the best from Future Human HQ.
Thank you very much, Dearbhail. It's been a big pleasure.